Okay. Hey, welcome to the PK's podcast. It's Wednesday. I think this is episode 4 in our series that we're doing about leading while bleeding. Um, yeah, I just want to talk to you a little bit today. Um, so the title of this podcast today is When God Puts Our Lives Out of Joint. The theme is wrestling with God in crisis. And we really think about how God moves in our lives, and so many times, we're like, God, I'm really struggling today. How can I make? How can you help me? How can you do this? How can this happen? Or we try to do things on our own, and we try to really just focus on us instead of on Him. We talked a little bit. I've talked a lot about in my tailgates. About doing for God versus being with God. And that's where we are a lot of times. A lot of times we want to just do and keep doing, but that's not what God wants us to do. God wants us to slow down. He wants us to be a part of what He is doing. He wants us to be a part of Him and the things that He wants to do, because when we get in the way, He can't do the things that He wants to do. And so that's what's really important with everything that I'm talking about, when I say leading while bleeding. Um, but sometimes God shows up in a way that just breaks us, not to harm us, but to redefine us. We're looking at a story that many of us know, Jacob wrestling with God in Genesis 32. you know, we see that Jacob, he spends the whole night wrestling with God until he puts his hip out of place, and then now Jacob has to walk around with a limp for the rest of his life. But Jacob was, he was a manipulator. He was a person that was a deceiver. He didn't, he could talk his way out of anything and into anything. We think about the story of Jacob and Esau. I mean, he talked Esau out of his birthright. And so, as we look at this story a little bit more, I want you to hear it through a different lens. Um, I want you to think about your life and where you have struggled, and where you have you have tried to do things on your own, where you've tried to manipulate God into saying, "Hey, do this for me, and then I will do this for you," type thing. We hear stories about that just in the movies and other places and those kind of things. But the struggle that changed everything. So Jacob had spent his life hustling. He was grabbing for things, he was manipulating, he was always scheming for the blessing. He, like I said before, he stole Esau's birthright. He tricked his father. He outmaneuvered Laban, to get to marry his daughter, so he had this history, but eventually, when we think about our lives, our striving, it finally starts to catch up with us, and so Jacob finds himself alone in the dark with everything on the line. I mean, he's sitting there, and a man a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Most of the time we assume this is God or an angel of the Lord or whatever. You know, God didn't send an angel to deliver a word. He came to wrestle. I think about that. I just contemplating on that just a little bit and really thinking that, okay, we're waiting on God to give us a word, but instead we have to wrestle with God to get the word back. Get the word, because sometimes what we need isn't just a sermon, it's a struggle. We need a struggle. We need something that gives us purpose, something that drives us to want to get closer to God. And in that struggle something begins to shift. You know, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint. Think about that. Think about that, guys. Think about, I need a word from God. I need this, but instead God is wrestling. God wants to wrestle with us. God wants to make us struggle to get that word. And sometimes we live in this microwave world that we want things so fast. We want things to just come at us. We want God to just give it to us. But you know what? God doesn't want to just give it to us because we're not going to learn anything if we just if he just gives it to us. And so it's important that we have to struggle sometimes. We have to struggle. It's like a baby learning how to walk. You have to crawl first. You have to fall down a few times. I mean, if we pick up the baby and we just carry him around all the time, then they're not going to learn anything. They're not learning how to walk. They're not going to build those muscles. They're not going to build that strength. And it's the same thing when we struggle spiritually. We're not going to build those spiritual muscles unless we break them down, unless God helps us break those down into bite-sized pieces where we can build it back up. And that's what God does to us sometimes. And so in this situation, God touched him. He marked him. He wounded him with a purpose. Think about it. Here's Jacob walking around with this limp, and every day he has to think about it. He has to think about, man, God, what did you do? And it's a reminder always that he has to put his trust in him. But let me ask you this question. Have you ever gone through a season where it felt like God wasn't answering, where he was just wrestling with you? Think about it. Think about that. You're praying for a breakthrough and it feels like resistance. You're asking for peace and it just feels like pressure all the time. What if God isn't ignoring you? He's forming you. Think about a diamond. How does a diamond form into a diamond? It's by pressure. It's coal that is just over time, that pressure has just built it into this diamond and made it into this rock hard substance, and that's what God's trying to do to us. You know, I mean, think about it. Think about it. You know, you're praying for this breakthrough and it feels like there's this just like resistance and everything, and you're asking for peace, but there's this pressure. But God's not ignoring you, he's forming you. He's forming you into that diamond that he knows that you can be. That you can last and you can sustain and you can continue to go and keep going, you know? And there's times it's been in my life where my life has been put out of joint, my out of joint season. I've had seasons like that. The biggest one that I can think of here recently, was me being going into the hospital for 4 days, with this infection that I didn't know what I had. And it took me down this path of really, finding out about myself and things that I could do and things that I could accomplish, and where God had to finally bring me back to this point of, I am God. I am the person that I am God. I am the one who you need to be following always. And and you see, it wasn't that God was changing my calling or anything, but basically my confidence was gone. My rhythm was off. The clarity was missing. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where I needed to go. I felt like everything that had once worked, it wasn't working anymore. All the same things that you keep doing over and over again, and it doesn't work. You're like, what am I supposed to do? And so God has to, come in. I'm not saying that God made me sick, before you say anything. I'm just saying that there are times in our lives when God has to take us to a place, things that are allowed, maybe to happen to us. But Looking back, I see clearly now that God wasn't trying just to strip my identity. He was revealing my true one. Like Jacob, I had to stop performing. I had to stop pretending and just hold on. I've been so good. I've been working on my book, and I've been so good at just pretending and faking church and faking relationships with God and faking all this stuff that it 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 becomes a part of you where that's who you are and that's what you do. And I know there's other people out there that do the same thing, but you see, God doesn't want us to do that. Like Jacob, I had to stop performing. I had to stop pretending, and I just needed to hold on, you know, because God says, I will not let you go or Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me, you know? And, and sometimes that's what we have to do with God. We have to hold on, even when the pressure gets so great that we don't think we can keep going, that we think that we're not gonna make it anymore, that we're not gonna be able to sustain, that we're not gonna be able to continue to do what we're doing. We have to hang on sometimes. And sometimes faith is loud, sometimes it's desperate, sometimes faith is just holding on, holding on to what you got, holding on to your faith when things seem like they're impossible. And when that blessing finally did come, for me, I'm walking around with a limp, but the limp was a sign of intimacy, a sign of an encounter. My limp for me is being diagnosed with, PTSD from Desert Storm, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and all of that, and that I walk around with it. There are days, I struggle with stuff. I struggle with anxiety and anger, all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't define who I am. It's just a reminder that I had to put all my trust in God, that I had to put all my trust in Him in order to accomplish the things that I need to accomplish and that I do accomplish. And so, that limp for me is a sign of an intimacy with God because I have to get quiet with Him. I have to be still with Him. I have to be with Him and not just do things. Because when I just do things over and over and over again and I don't slow down, then I'm just doing it on my own strength. But, the limp, it eventually leads to power. It leads to that strength that God is able to give us. I talk a lot about how Paul, is was he talks about how his weaknesses are made strong, or through his weaknesses he is made strong. And that's how it is. We live in a culture that idolizes strength, but in the kingdom, it's scars that tell the story. If I think, I think about preachers and pastors and people that I've listened to over the years, and I'm like, well, most of the time they have a story. They have a story to tell. And it's through those scars, that they can keep going. Yeah, there are some times when you hear a preacher, "Yeah, I was raised in a Christian home. I was, this and I was that, and I was all," but very seldom do you hear somebody that you want to listen to that doesn't have any scars, that doesn't have a story to tell, you know? And that's the thing, Jacob's limp wasn't a weakness, it was just evidence that he wrestled with God. He wrestled with God until God gave him the blessing that he needed and that he wanted. You know, he had been with God, he had wrestled with God, and he had been renamed. God gave him a new name. And he says, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Wow. I mean, think about that. We wrestle with God, I just, and I want to prevail. I want to be a part of him. I want to be that more than I want to be a conqueror, I want to be like David. But sometimes God won't let you move forward with your old name. Sometimes he's got to change that name. Sometimes he puts our lives out of joint, but it's not to break us, it's to rename us. to rename us that child of God, to be that person that God has meant for us to be. Each one of us has been called and for a purpose, for a reason, for whatever. God just didn't place us on this earth by chance. He wants us to live with him. He wants to commune with him. He wants us to be with him, in everything that we do. When I go on these walks and hikes in the morning times, I'm like, "Okay, God, you want to go on this hike with me? Let's go." And that's what happens. I just walk with God and just spend my time worshiping him in the middle of wilderness. And I caught myself this morning. I was singing the worship song that was playing in my ears, out loud. And it's like, okay, well, who's around? Well, nobody's around, but it's a thing that I'm spending time with God, you know. And after that wrestling match, yes, Jacob was still Jacob, but he carried a new identity. I could say I identify as a veteran, as a person with PTSD, 100% disabled, all those kind of things. I could say that I'm a father, I am a husband, um, I'm a grandpa, there's all kinds of different titles that I could place on myself, but the biggest title is that I'm a man of God and I'm a child of God. And that's what this is all about. It's what this is about today. So let me ask you this, what are you wrestling with right now? What's going on in your life? Is it possible that this isn't punishment, but it's just preparation? We're going to call it punishment, but you know what? To be a disciple of God, we have to be disciplined. Sometimes that discipline is hard. It's hard when we have to go through things that we don't want to go through, you know? Could it be that your limp is the very thing God will use to draw others to him? That's how I look at it. I look at it as, how many other veterans are out there, that struggle with PTSD or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or anxiety, depression, anger, or how many people, struggle with those mental health type issues. And that's what I want to be able to, help people. I want to be able to talk to people and share my journey, my struggle, my things that I go through. Am I perfect? No, I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect, and we're all going to struggle with anger and anxiety and so many times, in the Christian world, we're told, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't act that way. You can't." Well, you know what? Emotions are emotions, and you're going to have those emotions. And if you don't name them, if you don't claim them, then what what are you going to do? You know? And so many times in churches, we have taken it to the point where we have to be like emotionally perfect. Oh, tears, are they tears of joy? Are they tears of sadness? Are you angry about this? No, it's just, emotions. Jesus was emotional. And I've talked about that in some of my tailgates and things of that nature. You know, but could it be that your limp is the very thing that God wants you to draw others to him? Hmm. Think about your circle of friends. Think about your community. Think about who around you may need your help. And so many times we just want to rush on by. But you may be limping right now. You may feel like everything's out of joint. But that doesn't mean that you're off track. It means that you're exactly where God needs you to be. See, the Jacob story, it shows us that identity is found in the wrestling, not avoiding because of it. So don't despise the struggle. So many times we despise the struggle. Why, God? Why? Why am I doing this? Don't fear the breaking because what God is doing is preparing to come through you. He's preparing he's preparing that. So your limp doesn't disqualify you. It qualifies you. Did you catch that? Your limp doesn't disqualify you. It qualifies you. So think about that this week. Next week I'm going to be talking about, finding your peace and finding purpose in the middle of life storms. I'll share a little bit about my story, about some things and being a veteran and being a father. I'm at the section in my book now where I'm starting to talk about adoption and all of that. And so there's a lot of things that happened during that time. But no, I appreciate you guys. I thank you for just listening and bearing with me as I ramble on sometimes. But please make sure to subscribe, leave a review, send this to someone who's in the middle of their own wrestling match, because you know what? We're in this together. We're in this together. So leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Talk to you guys next week. Bye.